2016, Geoffrey Hinton, the man sometimes considered as the godfather of deep learning, a future Turing Award and Nobel Prize winner, stood in front of an audience and said something that sent shockwaves through medicine. He said, "People should stop training radiologists now. It's just completely obvious that within 5 years, deep learning is going to do better than radiologists." Now, to understand why he said that, you have to understand what had just happened in his world. Deep learning had gone from an academic curiosity to the most powerful pattern recognition technology ever built, seemingly overnight. Neural networks were crushing benchmarks that had stood for decades. From where Hinton was standing, at the absolute frontier of what these systems could do, his prediction wasn't reckless. It was a straight-line extrapolation from genuinely extraordinary results. But medicine, as it turns out, doesn't do straight lines. 10 years later, we're facing the largest radiologist shortage in history, with imaging backlogs stretching for months at some centers. The FDA has cleared over 1,000 AI medical devices, and the relationship between AI and radiology looks nothing like what anyone predicted on either side of the debate. This is the story of AI in medical imaging. It starts with a blurry mammogram in the 1990s, runs through a deep learning revolution, and lands in one of the most fascinating tensions in modern medicine: machines that can see things humans can't, but still can do what a doctor does. Welcome to Tech Anatomy. Think of a radiologist looking at a mammogram. They're scanning for things like tiny white spots, they're called calcifications, that might signal early cancer. Now, imagine giving them a highlighter that automatically circles areas worth a closer look. That's essentially what the first computer-aided detection systems did. The story begins at the University of Chicago in the late 1980s, where researchers at the Kurt Rossmann laboratories started developing algorithms that could spot patterns in medical images. These were not deep learning systems. Deep learning didn't exist yet in any practical sense. These were algorithms built on handcrafted rows. So if a cluster of bright pixels appears in a certain pattern, flag it. Think of it as spell check for X-rays. It doesn't make the diagnosis, it just underlines things that looked suspicious. A company called R2 Technology was founded in 1993 to commercialize this work, and in 1998, they received the first ever FDA approval for a computer-aided detection system in mammography, the Image Checker M1000. A laser digitizer would convert film mammograms into digital images, and a machine learning algorithm running on a standard PC would flag areas of concern. R2 eventually shipped over 1,200 systems worldwide, and more than 6.8 million women had their mammograms read with the help of Image Checker. These early systems were generally useful, but they had real limitations. They generated a lot of false alarms because the underlying pattern recognition was shallow. It could catch some visual signatures, but it could not learn the way a radiologist learns over thousands of cases. It couldn't build intuition from context. The technology that would change that was already being developed, but it would take another decade and a completely unrelated competition to light the fuse. In 2012, a team led by Geoffrey Hinton entered the ImageNet Large-Scale Vision Recognition Challenge, a competition to see whose algorithm could best identify objects in photos. Their entry, a deep neural network called AlexNet, didn't just win. It cut the error rate nearly in half compared to traditional methods. Now, here's a quick technical detour because understanding how this works makes the rest of the story much clearer. A convolutional neural network called CNN works by learning to recognize visual features in layers. The first layer might detect edges and textures. Deeper layers combine those into shapes, and deeper still into complex structures. What AlexNet revolutionized wasn't any single idea. It was the combination of deep architecture, massive training data, and GPU computing power that let the system learn these features on its own, rather than having engineers hand-code them. Researchers in medical imaging immediately saw the implications. If a neural network could learn to distinguish thousands of everyday objects by studying millions of photos, what could it learn from millions of X-rays? The floodgates opened. In 2016, a team at Google published a landmark study in JAMA showing that a deep learning algorithm could detect diabetic retinopathy, which is a leading cause of blindness, from retinal images with sensitivity above 90%. That same year, Stanford researchers showed in Nature that AI could classify skin cancer at a level comparable to board-certified dermatologists, training on a dataset of over 129,000 clinical images. In 2017, Stanford's GXNet project demonstrated a 121-layer neural network that could detect pneumonia from chest X-rays. The researchers used a specific architecture called DenseNet, where each layer connects to every other layer, helping the network learn more efficiently from the relatively small datasets available in medicine. The claim was that it outperformed radiologists on this specific task. This is the context in which Hinton made the prediction we talked about in the introduction. And honestly, if you were watching these results come in, retinal disease, skin cancer, pneumonia, are reaching or exceeding specialist-level performance, the trajectory looked pretty clear. The question wasn't whether AI would transform radiology, it was how fast. Then came 2 FDA clearances that turned theoretical potential into commercial reality. In February 2018, Viz.ai received the first ever FDA de novo clearance for an AI-based triage and notification system. Their platform could detect large vessel occlusion strokes on CT scans and alert the relevant specialist, on average, 52 minutes faster than the standard of care. In stroke treatment, there's a saying, time is brain. Every minute of delay means more tissue lost, so those 52 minutes represent a meaningful clinical difference. 2 months later, IDx-DR became the first fully autonomous AI diagnostic system cleared by the FDA, meaning it could make a clinical determination without a physician reviewing the result. It screened for diabetic retinopathy in primary care offices, achieving 87.2% sensitivity and 90.7% specificity. A patient could literally walk into a clinic, get a retinal scan, and receive a result in minutes, with no ophthalmologist required. These weren't incremental improvements. These were entirely new categories of medical technology. After those first clearances, the pace became staggering. By December 2024, the FDA had cleared over 1,016 AI medical devices. In 2025, 295 devices were cleared, a record year. And 76% of all FDA-cleared AI medical devices are in radiology. To appreciate the acceleration, between 1995 and 2015, so 20 years, only 33 AI devices were approved. In 2023 alone, 221 were approved. The companies that emerged span the full range of what AI can do in imaging. ADOC built an AI triage system for emergency radiology. Their platform, validated across 100,000 CT scans, achieved 97% sensitivity and 98% specificity. a real-world study showed a 30% reduction in mortality for patients with intracranial hemorrhage when the system was in use. Viz.ai became the first to receive FDA authorization for AI in pathology in 2021. Lunit, a South Korean company, secured clearances for chest X-ray and mammography AI. Zebra Medical Vision, founded in 2014 in Israel, racked up multiple clearances before being acquired by Nanox for about $200 million. Google's health team published a study in Nature in 2020 showing their breast cancer screening AI reduced false negatives by 9.4% and false positives by 5.7% compared to US radiologists, and even outperformed a pair of doctors reading the same images together. And Caption Health took AI in a completely different direction. Instead of reading images, their software guides non-specialists through performing ultrasound exams. Think of it as GPS navigation for an ultrasound probe. It received FDA clearance in 2020 and was acquired by GE Healthcare in 2023. But with that much activity, the picture gets more complicated because the gap between the cleared devices and a deployed, useful, paid-for tool turned out to be much wider than many expected. There's a common assumption that once an AI tool proves it can match a specialist's accuracy, the hard part is over. Well, in practice, that's where the hard part actually begins. Now, consider the IBM Watson project at MD Anderson Cancer Center. IBM partnered with MD Anderson in 2013 to develop an AI system for cancer treatment recommendations. They spent 5 years and $62 million. The project was eventually abandoned. We have a full episode on what happened with IBM Watson coming up in the next weeks, so stay tuned for that. Now, it's easy to look at this from the outside and call it a failure of technology. But the reality is more instructive than that. The original contract was for a leukemia-focused tool to be delivered in 6 months for $2.4 million. The scope expanded multiple times, shifting to lung cancer, broadening the ambition, etc. The underlying challenge was that the medical records at MD Anderson, like most hospitals, were messy, inconsistent, unformatted, and stored across different systems. The team discovered that the gap between the clean, structured data that the AI needed and the chaotic reality of clinical documentation was enormous. So although the pilot was successful, MD Anderson's audit said it wasn't ready for patient use. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The technology worked on clean data, but clinical reality isn't really clean data. So this pattern that technology performs well in controlled settings but stumbles in the real world showed up across all the field. A major review in Nature Machine Intelligence in 2021 examined over 300 AI models developed for COVID-19 diagnosis from medical images. The researchers, led by a team at Cambridge, found that not a single model was suitable for clinical deployment. Everyone had methodological issues. Datasets too small, training populations not diverse enough, no proper external validation, and so on. One systemic review of 86 deep learning algorithms in radiology found that 81% showed decreased accuracy when tested on data from a different hospital. A model with 95% accuracy on the data it was trained on might drop to 80% somewhere else because the CT scanner is different, or the patient population has different demographics, or the image processing pipeline introduces subtle variations. There are also deeper issues this field is still working through. A study in Nature Medicine showed that AI chest X-ray classifiers systematically underdiagnosed conditions in Black patients. A separate study in the Lancet Digital Health found that AI models can predict a patient's race from medical images alone, something human radiologists cannot do, through mechanisms researchers still don't fully understand. These findings don't mean the technology is broken, but they do mean it carries the biases of the data it was trained on. And those biases need to be understood and addressed before deployment. Then there's what researchers call automation bias. Studies presented at the Radiological Society of North America found that experienced radiologists, so people with over 15 years of practice, saw their accuracy drop from 82% to 45.5% when an AI system confidently suggested the wrong diagnosis. When the machine says, "This looks fine," there's a real tendency to agree. This isn't a character flaw in the radiologists. It's a well-documented cognitive pattern that shows up whenever humans work alongside automated systems from aviation to manufacturing. And there are structural barriers that have nothing to do with the AI itself. Less than 30% of FDA-cleared radiology AI devices have undergone clinical testing. Less than 2% have randomized trial data. Most were cleared through the 510K pathway, which requires showing the device is substantially equivalent to something already on the market, which is a framework designed for physical devices that some experts question whether it's rigorous enough for learning algorithms. Since then, things have changed and it's now a lot easier to bill for this type of services. All of which helps explain a striking statistic. Despite over 1,000 cleared devices, only about 2% of US radiology practices are actively using AI tools today. So where does that leave us? Not where Hinton predicted, but not where the skeptics predicted either. The story is more interesting than either extreme. Hinton himself revised his position. In a 2025 interview with the New York Times, he said he spoke too broadly in 2016, that he was thinking purely about image analysis, not about everything a radiologist does. He said he was wrong on the timing, though he still believes in the direction. His updated view is, most medical image interpretation will be performed by a combination of AI and a radiologist. And it will make radiologists a whole lot more efficient in addition to improving accuracy. That prediction is already being borne out. The strongest evidence comes from the PRAI trial, a massive prospective study embedded in Germany's national mammography screening system. Between July 2021 and February 2023, 463,094 women were screened across 12 sites by 119 radiologists using an AI system called VARA-MG. The results, published in Nature Medicine, are the following. AI-supported reading detected 17.6% more breast cancers with no increase in recall rates and a higher positive predictive value. Not AI replacing doctors, AI making doctors better. Curtis Langlotz, the Stanford radiologist who has become one of the most thoughtful voices in this space, put it this way. AI won't replace radiologists, but radiologists who use AI will replace radiologists who don't. He compared to autopilot in aviation. Pilots are happy to delegate the monotonous scanning, but passengers still want a human in the cockpit. And the workforce data tells its own story. At the Mayo Clinic, despite increasing AI adoption, the number of radiologists has grown from about 260 in 2016 to over 400 today. AI isn't eliminating positions, it's changing what those positions look like. At RSNA 2025, the world's largest radiology conference, the shift was noticeable. The conversation wasn't about whether AI works or whether it will replace anyone. It was about integration. How do you embed those tools into systems, clinical workflows? How do you train residents to work with AI rather than just learn to read images on their own? These are operational questions, not existential ones. And the technology itself is also evolving rapidly. We're entering the era of foundation models and multimodal AI, systems that don't just analyze a single image, but can process the image alongside the patient's medical history, lab results, prior imaging, a clinical note simultaneously. Eric Topol has written about what he calls the era of machine eyes. And the question that's emerging now is what happens when those machine eyes don't just see the X-ray, but see the X-ray in the context of everything else known about the patient. That's a fundamentally different capability from what Hinton was imagining in 2016, and that's the frontier being explored right now. So thank you so much for following us in this episode about AI in medical imaging. We will see you soon for another crazy story of health technology.